Okay, everyone, Jordan Peterson just released his new Exodus series on YouTube, and it looks like each episode will be about 2 hours. So if you're a fan of Jordan Peterson and the philosophical and psychological ideas he puts forward, but you don't necessarily want to sift through all the deep theological weeds, then this is the video for you. I'll cover the highlights and interesting moments that stood out to me, and you'll get my unique, interesting P.F. Jungian commentary. So let's jump right in. Okay, I just thought this was funny to start with. Watch very carefully this introduction from Jordan.
All right, so having said that and introduced everybody, we're going to start with the text, and as I said, I'll read it, and I'll make comments when they strike me, and we'll have everyone jump in, and away we'll go. So,
look where he's looking. He's looking up.
Exodus 1. Now, these are the names.
And they just give him an iPad, like, oh crap, the prompter went out. Take an iPad instead. I just thought that was funny. We'll move on to the real highlight. Let's start with this section that I found to be the most compelling of the entire 2-hour episode. The story of Moses as an infant being adopted by Pharaoh's daughter.
Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee?" And the Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." And the maid went and called the child's mother. It's very sneaky of the Hebrews. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, "Take this child away," so she adopts him, "and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages." And the woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So now he's the son of the king, the grandson of the Pharaoh. So interesting that
it's also very powerful as an adoptive father. I have two sons, one biological, one adoptive. And this has always spoken to me profoundly, that she is regarded as his mother, and she's clearly not his biological mother. Mm-hmm. In Jewish tradition, she is which is remarkable to me, because you would think blood would be dominant, but in later Jewish tradition, she is called Batya, the daughter of God, and she is regarded as Moses' mother.
Mm-hmm. Really interesting.
Very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's Pharaoh's daughter. This is a non-Jewish moral agent who acts in a saintly way, and I think this gives us a first taste of a theme that's going to come to dominate.
Right, that morality isn't bound by ethnicity.
That's right. This is the great gift of the Jewish people. This insight that morality is universal, is a gift to the world, is something that all human beings, as it were, are bound to. Paul later in the New Testament makes this point again in Romans 1 and chapter 1 and chapter 2 of Romans, that the Gentiles, as it were, have the law written upon their hearts.
Yeah, so that's another echo of that notion of a transcendent good, right?
Exactly, which in the context of ancient Near Eastern religion, it's difficult to sort of exaggerate the point too much. You know,
right.
It really is quite extraordinary, that this idea that there is a moral code that cuts right across all tribes and all nations.
Well, it's
and all
anthropologically
religions.
absurd in some sense, because the anthropological evidence...
Anthropologically absurd. I'm saving that for use at some point.
Suggests that we're pretty damn tribal, and that the fundamental human response, in some sense, towards people who aren't of your tribe is that they're not human.
Yeah.
So it's really an amazing vision beyond the parochial confines of, well, tribe and nation. And to Dennis's point, the elevation of the foreigner to an ethical status that supersedes the ethical status of the in-group ethnic member. Right, amazing thing. That's an amazing thing. It's very hard to account for that.
I thought that was so interesting that a non-Jew is called Batya, the daughter of God, because, you know, you have all of this political conspiracy thinking around Jewish people, and it's not like there isn't kernels of truth rooted in all conspiracies, but at the theological foundation of the Jewish faith is the idea that a non-Jew, a non-member of the ethnic in-group, is elevated to a high moral status. And to me, that's a very interesting and just compelling point that stood out to me. And it directly counters the ideas that, you know, Jews are only in it for themselves, and everywhere they go, they, you know, cause problems and whatnot. It's like, look at the foundational theology, and you'll see that the very narratives that their faith is rooted in doesn't support that. This part is very cool because it's about how, in order to be a good person, you need to basically be a bad person and willing to sin and willing to cause problems in order to develop the wisdom to be a moral agent.
So my point is not political at all, but that was my argument with regard to Donald Trump. The idea that because he is a man who has committed many sins, he is not an appropriate leader has no biblical basis.
Well, we'd all be in trouble if the precondition for action was sinlessness.
That's clear.
Yeah. And wasn't what was William Blake's dictum? Wisdom through excess. And there's also ideas that are reflected in the Gospels too, that there's more treasure in some spiritual sense heaped up by those who dare to sin and then repent and are reclaimed than those who are too terrified to take any action whatsoever on the off chance that they might make a mistake.
Don't do drugs, but consider it, maybe. Just kidding. Don't do drugs, actually.
He says the same thing in Revelation when he comes back as a judge. He says that his harshest judgment isn't reserved for those who are hot or those who are cold, so the good or the evil for that matter, but for those who play both ends against the middle and sit and never commit. And that's
the kleptocratic moderates, not the radical centrists like me and everyone who watches this channel, but the moderates, the people who just hide behind the shadows and profit without actually believing anything.
Really an interesting idea, right, is that in some real sense, God, at least how God's represented in the Old Testament, is definitely the spirit on the side of the adventurous, for better or for worse. And that's quite something, right? Because it also, I think, bears some sheds some light on this notion of the terrifying element of the transcendent. It's not, whatever God's goodness is, it's not some simple, harmless, like all-encompassing, weak compassion. It's something terrifying in its moral breadth, because it would really be something if the Spirit of God is on the side of the rampantly adventurous. And I think you can make a strong case for that, at least from within the confines of the biblical corpus. I mean, Abraham's an adventurer, Moses is an adventurer, Noah's an adventurer. These are people David's an adventurer. They aren't people who stayed home and tried to never cause any trouble, right? Which is a kind of emasculation in and of itself.
This one was just interesting for me because I constantly struggle with like, oh, my conscience is telling me do the right thing, do the right thing, do the right thing. But oftentimes doing the right thing is not just some simple like, well, follow the rules, follow the rules. It's like, well, maybe the right thing is break the rules to develop your character to become the kind of person who can do good in a deeper sense. I think it's complicated and there's very gray lines everywhere, but it certainly disabuses me of the notion that we'll just follow simple rules and that's how morality is done. It's like, it's way more complicated than that and it's much more of an adventure. This part's interesting because it highlights the kind of theological conversation that's going on and how it's subject to all kinds of weird interpretation issues regarding the ambiguity of language. And I think this is like an example of what atheists would criticize Jordan Peterson for in terms of projecting an interpretation. But let's watch.
And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Shiphrah and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them upon the birthing stools, if it be a son, then you shall kill him. And that's that instrumental usage that you were talking about before.
There is a huge issue here. The Hebrew is completely indeterminative whether the midwives were Hebrews or not. Mialdota Ivriot, and I'm not going to throw out Hebrew often. I feel very self-conscious at all.
L'chaim.
But for those who know Hebrew, they will know what I'm talking about. It can be the Hebrew midwives or the midwives of the Hebrews. There is no possible way, based on those two words, to know which it is. I am convinced, and Jewish tradition doesn't agree with me. I mean, post-biblical Jewish tradition. The Torah, I think, does agree with me, but c'est la vie. I believe they were Egyptian. I do not believe he would have ordered Hebrew midwives to murder every Hebrew boy.
Do you think there's a purposeful ambiguity there to leave it up to question?
That's beautiful.
Watch his body
language. It may
language.
well be. That's right. Well, it certainly is. The Hebrew is ambiguous. That is correct.
I mean,
So that's an example of like, okay, according to the translation, we can't know if they were Egyptian or Hebrew midwives. And then Peterson suggests, well, maybe instead of that just being a failure of language, it's actually purposeful. It's ambiguous because it increases the narrative power of the story. And that's an example where it's like, maybe that's the case, but I can very much see how that would be seen as you're just projecting whatever interpretation you want to elevate the status of the story.
I want to pick up on what you said, Dennis, a little before, and I want to propose that there might be a very important narrative reason why the midwives are Hebrew in this case. And the reason, I think it's a good lesson for us today. which is that the tyrant is empowering women to kill their men. That is what the tyrant is
listen to
doing.
this.
And he's doing it in order to feminize the Hebrews. And I think that
No wonder you get in trouble all the time.
So that right there, that's a perfect example of, well, the text is ambiguous about whether it was Hebrews or Egyptians killing the children. And if it's Hebrews killing their own children, well, then it's a more evil narrative, and it's supposed to be then able to, be used in the context of abortion today. That is where I can completely understand. You're just projecting an interpretation to suit your political end in terms of, well, this narrative is clearly saying that they're Hebrews because it's speaking to the evil of abortion. And I don't buy that.
Because they're the ones who keep the real
That's such an
tyrants at bay.
intelligent point that it reinforces your reaction to what I said. Maybe the text is purposefully ambiguous about whether or not they were Hebrews or Egyptians.
Yeah.
And you've swayed me.
Well, I've seen that purposeful ambiguity in other texts.
So let me just say...
Okay, if that's true, then maybe this is not as goofy as I think it is, but listen.
I know I identify a bias in me, and I will reveal it. I'm very, I hope, self-aware.
Good, so the first learning episode has actually occurred.
Yeah, exactly.
Owned. The alpha owns the beta weak theologian. I just think that's an example of, I used to think that it was ambiguous, or I used to think it was clearly the Egyptians doing the killing, but it's actually ambiguous. Oh, but if I can use this narrative to further support against abortion, then now I'm convinced. Like, to me, that's a very clear example of motivated reasoning. But I suppose when I die, I'll ask God himself. This part is a very cool biological point, which are generally my favorite points that Jordan Peterson makes about fire and its relationship to our psychology.
Fire is also this mysterium tremendum and fascinans that you described, because I think biologically, and I'll think about this from an evolutionary perspective, we're all descendants of the first proto-human chimpanzee analog who absolutely 100% could not stop looking at fire. Right, and fire is absolutely fascinating to human beings. It's so interesting to watch people around a campfire, for example, where we feel at home. We gaze into the fire, and the fire seems to me to be something that escapes what's called latent inhibition, is that almost everything we see after we've seen it multiple times, we see as a representation of memory. We don't see the thing itself, but fire is one of those things that escapes that, and we see fire as something that's constantly new, plus it's always constantly changing.
So the point about when you see something so many times, you see it actually as a representation of memory, I believe this is why, for those who've experienced this, if you stare at yourself in the mirror, or you're maybe like drunk or you're on substances or whatever, because in order to have an adventure, you need to sin and do things to break rules and all that, there are certain points where you'll notice, like, because you see yourself in the mirror all the time, you're seeing that as a function of memory, but sometimes you'll catch a glimpse of yourself as if it's novel, as if it's escaped latent inhibition in the way that fire does, according to Peterson. And it's kind of creepy. It's like, oh my God, I'm seeing myself as if I would see myself as if I was another person. Sometimes it's with other people too. It's like if you stare at one of your friends, not this, I've ever done this, of course, that'd be weird. But like sometimes you can catch a glimpse of someone's face who you've known for years, and you like almost see them as a new person. And it was just a very interesting point that he made.
And we cannot look away from it, just like we can't look away from little children. And we can't look away from sexual beauty. These things.
It's an awkward juxtaposition of those two, but
things all escape the tyranny of our conceptualization.
Like for me, dogs playing, it's just like, or like cute puppy videos, or, porn or whatever. It's like the stuff that comes across your feed all the time that, it's interesting to watch, even though you've seen something like it 1,000 times or more. It escapes latent inhibition. And that's just an interesting biological point about how most of the things you see are actually represented perceptually as functions of memory. And that's just a very cool biological point. This part is a recapitulation of what I honestly think is the most fundamental idea that I've internalized in my life that Jordan Peterson has laid out.
People have asked me, and I'm always embarrassed by this, but people have commented on my courage for speaking up, so to speak. And I think you don't actually understand the situation. I'm not courageous in my speaking up. I'm more afraid of the alternative. And part of the reason for that was that when I was a clinician and I spent tens of thousands of hours dealing with people's serious problems, one of the things I learned was, and I really learned this, was that you don't get away with anything And so you might think you can bend the fabric of reality and that you can treat people instrumentally and that you can bow to the tyrant without and violate your conscience without cost, but that is just not the case. You will pay the piper. When you pay, you might not even notice the causal connection between the sin and the payment. And one of the things you do in psychotherapy is people's lives take a twist and they go very badly wrong. And when you walk back through people's lives with them, you come to these choice points where you meet the devil at the crossroads and you find out that, well, you went left, let's say, and downhill when you should have gone right and uphill, and now you're paying the price for that. And you don't impose that as a therapist. You help people discover that or rediscover it, because they often know at the time that they've made an error and then forget and then rationalize the forgetting and then, and then multiply the lies. And so
the idea that no matter what you do, you don't get away with anything. I sort of believe on faith. And the more that I have lived my life with that perspective, the more I think it's correct, because when you tell a lie, you might get away with it in the moment, but then you become the kind of person who is able to tell lies more effectively. And then inevitably, over time, you pay a price for that. And the point about going back to an origin point and realizing it was a mistake you had made many years ago, it's like, well, that's all about childhood trauma. It's like who you are as an adult is fundamentally shaped by your childhood experiences. And that's 100% the case. We'll end with this section, which I think is a perfect intersection of the biological and scientific with the spiritual and religious. This is another one of those lessons that I've internalized deeply.
Well, and here's something that's relevant to that too. So I know neuropharmacologically, I studied pleasure as a biological mechanism, and the intense pleasure that's associated with joy and enthusiasm. So enthusiasm is to be filled with God, theos, and theos. It's to be filled with the Spirit of God. You do not experience joy as a consequence of achieving a goal. You experience joy as a consequence of positing a goal and then noting progress towards the goal. And so a corollary of that is that...
Meaning, those videos of someone gets a letter saying they got accepted into college and they freak out or whatever. The goal wasn't get into college, or rather that was a goal that was subservient to another goal. In other words, that was simply a means to an end. Getting accepted into a really good college is progress towards an ultimate goal, which is getting whatever career or life you want to live that comes about as a result of attending that college. So he'll expand on this more here.
The higher the goal, the more intense the joy attendant on observation of progress towards it. And so then you might say, if you wanted to maximize the possibility of hedonic expression, not to degenerate into a cheap hedonism, but to maximize it in the most real sense, and this is a Viktor Frankl idea in some fundamental senses, you pick the most noble possible goal, and that's the mountain, that's service to God, again, by definition, right? Because it's service to the highest thing, whatever that is. And then that opens the door, that does literally open the door to it's a precondition for the experience of joy. And so these people who are depressed and anxious and miserable, part of the reason for that is that their ethic is scattered. Their goals are diverse and low level. There's nothing beckoning in the distance. And so they can't see progress because there's no progress, and certainly not progress to a superordinate goal. So there's actually no positive emotion. And that's technically the case, because the positive emotion system is a calibration system that produces navigation orientation towards a destination point. That's literally how it functions.
So in order to experience positive emotion, you must posit the highest possible good you can conceptualize, and we can derive something like that from these stories in the Bible. And it's a very compelling point. Here's another funny thing to end on.
That was a good start. Well, these were tough. These were tough ones.
These were tough.
Yeah. Wait till the 10 Commandments.
Yeah.
These were tough. In other words, reading the genealogy of so-and-so was the son of so-and-so of the tribe of this and that, yeah, that's rough. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. I will do one of these highlight videos for each of the oncoming episodes, so stay tuned for that. And if you've got any feedback, if you think they should be longer, there's some highlights that I cut out to get to these main ones to keep it kind of short, but please let me know your thoughts. And as always, good luck and Godspeed.